Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lara Handsfield. I am a professor in the School of Teaching and Learning. I'm in the area of literacy, elementary literacy, as well as bilingual education. And my research of late has focused on teachers and students' identities, and in particular, how their identities are discursively negotiated in the context of instruction or in classrooms. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the notion of making meaning and making selves. And what I mean by that is how understanding of the world around us, including texts, those kinds of interpretations, are actually connected to making selves or constructing identities. So I'm going to be presenting to you a paper that my co-authors, Patricia Valente, who was also a teacher in Unit 5 and the teacher of the students who participated in the study, as well as Aline who was one of my doctoral students who is dissertating as I present this. So here we go, I think. Here we go. So I sort of alluded to this when I was on the last slide, but one of the primary premises of my research is that academic achievement is not the only thing that children and teachers are producing in classrooms, so that it's not just learning that is achieved, but it's also identities. And this really is something that honestly most parents and teachers care about. So this quote from Johnston, I think, sums that up nicely. When children grow up, they are not only going to be wage earners, they're going to be citizens, parents, spouses, teachers, politicians, artists, etc., etc. This is also very consistent with the democratic ideal, which sounds, obviously that's our conceptual framework. I take that very seriously in my work, and it actually frames much of my work. With regard to comprehension instruction and identity research and literacy instruction, there have been, for the most part, parallel lines of research. And much research on comprehension instruction has found that comprehension is discursively negotiated, and that identity within literacy classrooms and in classrooms in general are often discursively negotiated. And what I mean by that is that they're negotiated by our language, what we say, and also what we do. So I'm thinking about language broadly, also thinking about body language and movements. At the same time, there's also been a lot of research that has conceptualized discourse as a mediational tool for learning. So if you've had a chance to read some of May Jadala's work, she has done a lot of work, very different kinds of discourse analysis, but really investigating how discourse as a tool help children learn. And then it's also, again, been framed as a mediational tool for identities, for thinking about who we are as people. So I'm really trying to bring a lot of this together in my work to look at the discursive negotiation of both social and academic identities in elementary classrooms. And I'm focusing, again, Patricia Valente was my co-PI in this research. So we did this research in her classroom. Our broad research question was, how do Patricia and her students discursively position one another to construct and or contest social and academic identities as they negotiate textual meaning during comprehension instruction? Kind of a mouthful. And more specifically, we're investigating how do students' social and academic identities become sedimented and or change over time in the context of comprehension instruction. We're also looking at what relationships exist between students' social and academic identities and their discursive negotiations of textual interpretations. And that's really probably the most primary of questions that's really the most tied to our primary higher level research question. We also are curious, and not because we have a lot of faith in standardized tests, but we're curious what relationships may exist between students' social and academic identity trajectories with respect to discourse. and their comprehension growth as measured by standardized school-based reading assessments. In this talk, I'm really focusing on this middle research question. So in terms of how I understand identity and discursive positioning, I find my thinking in line with many others in the field of literacy studies and language research who consider identities as multiple. In other words, I don't have one identity, I have many identities, and these often morph with each other. They're fluid and sometimes come together and sometimes are ruptured in different social contexts. And that identities are always infused with power relationships. So who I am as a mom is meshed together with who I am as a literacy professor, and those both come into play when I am, say, conferencing with my son's teacher in a parent-teacher conference. Individuals are also called into identities as others sort of assign them identities or labels or recognize them as certain kinds of people. And so this is something that relates a lot to text leveling, for example. When we label students as certain kinds of learners, as low or as high or as a level M or what have you, they will often take up those identities. They're called into them and then begin to animate them. At the same time, people will also resist identities by taking up language and texts in creative and sometimes unexpected ways. And so these processes of constructing identities, negotiating the kinds of identities contesting those that are assigned to us, involve discursive positioning, or how people locate themselves in relation to those identities and how they use language and their bodies and whatnot in that process. For me, that part in particular involves paying close attention to micro contexts of everyday life. For me, I believe that it's as we navigate our daily lives, the everyday contexts, everyday life in classrooms, in which those kinds of negotiations take shape and form. And I think that's important because if we can recognize those everyday moments in life, looking very closely at language, if we can identify those small spaces where we might take up, even if briefly, a different identity or a new identity, if we can identify how that operates, we can really be supporting teachers and our teacher candidates in thinking about language that way and thinking about how they're positioning students in their everyday classroom life. And so another way of looking at that is it goes beyond broad curricular constructs and is really more about how we speak and interact within these finer moments of a broader curriculum, sort of a devil is in the details kind of approach. Patricia teaches in a 4th grade bilingual classroom. She is white and is a native English speaker, but she speaks Spanish fluently, and her husband is Mexicano. They speak Spanish in the home. You know me, I identify as white and female. I'm a former bilingual teacher, although I do not share the cultural heritage of the vast majority of my former students or Patricia's students. And then Aline, my doctoral student, is multilingual. She's from Brazil and she's also a former teacher. Patricia's students, she had 13 at the time. Some of them are simultaneous bilinguals, meaning that they really grew up speaking both Spanish and English. Some were English dominant and some were Spanish dominant, had various countries of origin. And her school and her district operates a transitional bilingual ed program. So this is important because infused through this project are although I'm not foregrounding them in this talk, but infused throughout the research are language ideologies. And transitional bilingual programs really emphasize moving into English-only classrooms rather than maintaining bilingualism. Patricia really wanted to maintain her students' Spanish, and that often came through, but it wasn't the model of the program. She implemented a reading writing workshop approach, very dialogic in many ways, although there are many interactions that we noticed in her classroom that are a little bit more monologic, where she is telling and students are expected to be receiving. But that wasn't the vast majority of the discourse in her classroom. Let's see. I think I'm just going to go on. You can pause if you want to and read the rest of this in detail. We identified 6 focal students and we're developing case studies of these students. In this paper, I'm going to be focusing on Fresita. And by the way, all of the students selected their own pseudonyms. So you'll see that we have we have Chicharito there, who's a famous Mexican soccer player for Manchester United. All right, data generation and analysis. Just a ton of data over an entire school year. The data I'm really going to be focusing on in this paper are 18 video recorded observations of literacy instruction, both whole group and small group, in both Spanish and English. And we collected these, we video recorded instruction in all of those areas, both languages and both small group and whole group, in the fall, again in the winter, and again in the spring. And this allowed us to really conduct some close analyses of both utterances as transcribed during instruction and body positioning through the video. In terms of data analysis, I did some pretty, what's likely familiar to you in terms of recursive qualitative coding. I started with low inference coding and then moved on to higher inference coding, and then also developed some broader categories using a process similar to axiocoding. But it's really the microethnographic discourse analysis that is the meat of these analyses. So I want to focus on that a little bit more in depth. So the micro part, you get that small chunks, goes along with this theory that a lot of what's really interesting in discursive positioning happens in these small moments in everyday life. And then ethnographic means sort of about a culture or a community. So the idea is looking with a very fine lens at discourse and interactions and body movements to understand some of the broader ideologies and cultural elements of Patricia's comprehension instruction. So the idea is that by taking this fine lens, we can untangle how dominant meanings, cultural, societal meanings or understandings are reinscribed, and then how teachers and students may change them or develop new meanings in social relationships. So with transcripts, this means really being very careful about some linguistic annotation of the language, dividing manuscripts into interaction units, that's the middle bullet, but sort of strings of talk or interactional events that sort of have a commonly understood expectations for participating, who's in charge, who has the floor, etc. And then also breaking those into message units. So I'll show you what this looks like. So in this transcript, for example, we have, this is the speaker and who's speaking to whom. And then here we have turns. So this is Fresita's turn to talk, and she has one message unit here that he wants everything. And then Patricia chimes in that who wants everything. And several students say Christopher Columbus. And here we see Patricia with two message units, but who, so really focusing on the who, and then what that person's doing, who is he working for. And down here you can see Patricia has a longer string of talk where she says, so when he looked outside, Columbus says this is Spain's country. And then over here on the right, we have contextualization cues, and this includes stills from the video in which there are particular body movements that might help us make sense of how students and Patricia are positioning one another. All right, moving on. Hope you're not getting dizzy with this Prezi. So I'm focusing on Fresita in this paper. Fresita, Patricia really wanted to focus on Fresita in this study because she is a very strong, she's a child with a very strong personality. She's a very strong social awareness. She's very aware of others around her, including others' body language, and she's also very aware of her own social and academic status. She's very extroverted. She's often understood by her peers and had taken up sort of an identity as a bully. She also suffered from test anxiety. Institutionally, she was deemed by the district to be below grade level on assessments, both qualitative reading inventories as well as standardized tests such as measures of academic progress. So she was in the yellow on the school data wall, although you can see that her reading level progressed over the spring. In terms of reader identities, at the beginning of the school year, she really over-relied on others for interpretations. Fairly low self-concept of herself as a reader. She even once referred to herself as a bad girl and therefore not as good a reader. And we can see some of this positioning in terms of over-reliance of others and low self-concept in this transcript. I know that this is in Spanish and you may not read Spanish, so I'm going to explain to you a little bit of what's going on here. What's happening is that they're around the table and they are reading a text about Christopher Columbus in a whole unit on point of view and perspective taking. And what's really interesting here is that Fresita, partway into this interaction, a boy named Alejandro had asserted his perspective on why Columbus dreamed of traveling on the wide open sea, and said, porque él nació allí, because he was born there. And what Fresita does in this moment is pretty interesting. She challenges Alejandro, and she looks at him and says, nació allí? And it's really sort of exaggerated. And what's really interesting is that she sort of frames this, and the intonation of her speech is one of skepticism, where she's really challenging, nació ahí? Like, are you crazy? What are you saying? But at the same time, in this picture, she's actually looking at the teacher. So even when she was challenging students, she would look to the teacher for that verification. Am I getting this right? Help me out here. Am I saying the right thing? So really looking for that external support for her views, and not, you know, an indication that she wasn't fully confident in herself and more over-reliant on others, in particular the teacher. This is a transcript with a string of video stills from mid-year, from February in the winter. And this is a text that they were reading about elephants and other animals and their hearing. I think in particular they were there was some discussion as to elephants' cognition. And Patricia had said, so that is a similar thing to what? And Fresita said, humans, kind of quietly. And she's looking up at Patricia, similar kind of behavior that we saw in the fall. And then Fresita says, and they think in their mind. And at this point, another student, this girl Isabel, takes up her speech and said, yeah, humans do that. And then Patricia then takes this up, and with the authority of a teacher, she's giving Fresita's statement even more credence. So she says, can you, right here, we'll talk. Right here on your board, can you find a quote in there, just like Fresita did, find a new one. So she's in a sense positioning Fresita as that academically competent and even peer model for what she wants the rest of her students to do. And you can actually see in Fresita's positioning, she's sort of glancing up at Patricia, and here she's getting uptake from other students, and she's looking at them. And then you can see this sort of sense of pride as Patricia is taking that up instructionally for the benefit of the other students. At the end of the end of the school year, in April and May, when we finished up our video recording, we noted that Fresita was taking up more interpretive authority and assuming more interpretive authority and actually getting uptake from her peers and being ascribed interpretive authority from her peers, not just from Patricia. And so that was pretty interesting. So they're talking about the choice that some families have to make in some parts of the world, their children going to school and not being able to work and make money for the family, or not going to school and working to support the family so that they would have enough money to eat. And Patricia had sort of said, yeah, they had to choose between school or food. And Eddie had said, I would pick school. And Patricia's sort of getting to think, well, what are we going to write here? And Andrea Jenna says, without any food, you could die. And Patricia's like, so what? And Eddie says, yeah, without water, you could die. And then Fresita says, but I don't want to be dumb. Patricia says, I know it's a dilemma, isn't it? And Andrea Jenna says, but I don't want to die. So it's this little kind of back and forth. And then Patricia's trying to bring it back together and says, let's, and Eddie says it's the same thing. But then at this point, Fresita takes the floor. And she does this while a lot of others are talking. And these are students who she's grouped with who are pretty academically advanced in terms of their literacy skills and their literate identities. And Fresita weighs in and she says, you don't want to be dumb, you don't want to die. And Isabel takes that up and says, yes, it's a good debate, isn't it? And Fresita, as she does this, it looks here like she's looking at Patricia. Patricia's sitting back. And all of the other students are looking at, except for perhaps one of them, except for perhaps her, all of the other students are looking toward Fresita, and she's balancing with her hands. So she's sort of making a broad interpretation about what the dilemma involves, which is something that we didn't see her doing much in the fall. For what it's worth, her test data were, again, you got to take these with a grain of salt, right? We all know that. But she had gone from in the yellow, well below grade level, to above grade level. Breaking between a Fountas and Pinnell level U and V sends her up to a 5th grade level at the end of 4th grade, which was quite a jump for her. She wasn't the only one who jumped that much in her test scores. But what's interesting is that we noticed a strong correlation for her between her discursive positioning and how she was positioned by Patricia and the other students, and some of those, well, maybe not her MAP scores. We think that her final MAP score there, the 180, was an anomaly. She definitely had some test anxiety that day, but definitely in her Fountas and Pinnell reading levels, which I think are a more reliable source of information about students' progress, she really did progress quite substantially. So, you know, in terms of powerful positioning and interpretive authority, which are things that we saw in play throughout the year in the video recordings and through our microethnographic discourse analysis, we noted a lot of content-oriented questioning on Patricia's part, as well as prompts for elaboration. And this is really consistent with some previous research on reading comprehension that has challenged sort of just basic comprehension strategy instruction. In addition, when students made unwarranted assertions, Patricia asked students to explain and back up their thinking. Also, by her body positioning and gaze, right, we believe that that was pretty substantial for Fresita in really developing, sort of beginning to take on an academic identity of one who has interpretive authority. And interestingly, along with this, she had also developed into somebody who no longer had a identity as a bully among her friends. And that was really, really interesting. So we think that it's not just that her gestures and her body positioning and gaze were supporting her utterances. It's not just that they were ancillary to language, but we think that that body positioning and gaze and movement that Patricia engaged in as a teacher was just as central as what she was saying for these notions of powerful positioning and who was ascribed and who took up interpretive authority in her classroom. We're still analyzing other data. We've delved into data around one of the other participants, Chicharito. We're still in the midst of that. Interestingly, Chicharito did not develop as a reader and in terms of identity trajectories in the same ways that Fresita did. So we're investigating right now what kinds of differences there may be in how those two children were positioned by others, by themselves, and by Patricia in the classroom. Excuse me. If you want to pause it here, you're welcome to look at some select references. You can only throw so many on a page, but those are them for you. And I think oh gosh, I've gone a few minutes over. Hope you had 25 minutes to spare. Thanks for listening, and I would love to entertain any of your questions or comments. So thanks very much.